that God wants us to be and to make better disciples. That's the big picture. And so with that in mind, let's hear how Luke tells the tale of this type of discipleship that Jesus calls us to. Now great crowds accompanied him, and he turned and said to them, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, 'This man began to build and was not able to finish.' Or what king going out to encounter another king in war will not sit down first and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is yet a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. So therefore, any of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. Salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown away. He who has ears to hear, let him hear." When we talk about disciples, I think that this is one of those big religious words, even though it's a short word, that most of us don't even understand what is a disciple. And that's why I'm thankful for the time that I've had in my little side gig with Marketplace Chaplains. On a weekly basis, I go and I talk with these people who are disciples. We call them apprentices. And an apprentice, such as one of the ones that I met, one of our clients is Hiller Plumbing. And there's this one young man who I've really started to enjoy having weekly conversations with. He works for a master plumber, and all day, every day, he is learning every aspect of the plumbing business. He is an apprentice, but clearly you can see how this looks like a disciple as we read in the scriptures. The thing is that no one falls into plumbing. I mean, it's not something that you say one day, "Oh, gee, I guess I'll fix this thing." It's not like this young man will wake up in a few years and realize, "Oh, gee, I can dismantle, repair, and reconstruct all the plumbing that's under the house." He has to learn all of the concepts, and then he has to train his hands to do the work of the situation, whether it's light or dark, cold or hot, whether he's on his back or on his feet. At all angles, he has to be able to do this. An apprentice must gain skill to operate in any condition. And this takes discipline. And that's the point of discipleship. When one is a disciple, the word disciple comes from, it's derived from discipline. Discipline is the way, not only of plumbers, it is the way of athletes, of musicians, of philosophers, of farmers. All of them must have this measure of discipline, but we live in an age of distraction. In fact, I may have already lost some of you because if you're a baby boomer, you have a 20-second attention span. And you are looking down at Generation Z, who has an 8-second attention span. And by the way, a goldfish has a 9-second attention span. And who can we thank for this? We can thank the team that made the smartphone. This is the straight up. Because the average American or average young adult spends 42 hours a week on their device. That's 6 hours a day. Boomers, you spend 3.5 a day. So you're still spending 24.5 hours a week. One day of your week is on your cell phone. That's a big problem. And that's something that we see all around us. And even if you aren't on your phone that much, okay, let's say it's half that much. So you spend half a day per week on your phone. That's if you spend a scant 1.75 hours per day on the phone. It's not likely, but in the event that you do, it's still a big problem. We are distracted. And that's where the way of Jesus clashes with our culture. The word that I've read to you is completely at odds with where our world is right now. This is part of the reason why we need the Holy Spirit. Because the church would never continue were it for our own inclinations and our own desires. But the point of all of this is that there are no accidental apprentices. I was reading this. I'm reading this book called The Way of Jesus by John Mark Comer, and he makes this observation. I'm around chapter 3 or so. He said, it's not like we wake up when we're 50 years old and say, wow, I just noticed that I've become generous. How did that happen? There are no accidental apprentices. All of us must apply discipline to become like Jesus. In fact, there are two main ideas that Jesus lays out for us here in this passage. The first is that disciples are deliberate. Disciples are deliberate. That's verses 25 through 33. And second is that disciples are different. That's verses 34 through 35. And we'll see how this all fits together. But first, let's start to look at this idea that disciples are deliberate. They have a deliberate attitude. Look with me at verse 26. At verse 26, here's what we read. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Well, let me give you a little bit of explanation, because some of you may have got your hackles up already because I said the H word, right? I said hate. Hate your wife. Hate your children. Hate your mother. Hate your father. It might not be so hard for some people to hate their boss, but that's your boss, not mine. But what I'd say is this, is that the word hate here must be understood in its proper Middle Eastern context. You read in Genesis that Jacob hated Leah, but he loved Rachel. Does that mean that he actually wishes she was dead? No, not at all. It also says that Jacob I have loved and Esau I have hated. Does that mean that God hated Esau? No. It's a Middle Eastern way of saying that in comparison to the love that Jacob had for Rachel, the love that he had for Leah seemed like hate. And so that's the point that Jesus is making here in his very Middle Eastern context. We need to remember that. So they have a deliberate kind of attitude, a white hot love for God. That is what Jesus is calling all of us to. If anyone comes to me and does not have a white hot love for Jesus in comparison to everything that you hold dear, you are not worthy to be his disciple. So the point is, love Jesus more than anything else you have. Love Jesus more than anything you've ever lost. Love Jesus supremely. So that's the attitude that we must have if we are going to be deliberate disciples, and all disciples are deliberate. The second is an action. The first is an attitude, one of loving Jesus above all else, and the second is a deliberate action that we read in verse 27. There in that verse, we read, "Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple." Again, Jesus is calling us, come after me, follow me. This is the way of the disciple, is that we follow Jesus because we find in him something that is so beautiful that we cannot imagine being with any other. In fact, we want to be like Jesus. And this is the attitude that every apprentice should have of our master. But there's also an implied question here. Is my question for all of us as we approach this idea of being a follower of Jesus is, are we here for a good time, or are we here rather for a long time? Which do you want? Do you want to be here for a good time, or do you want to be here for a long time? I'm going for a long time, because I know that if I love Jesus supremely, it will be both a good time and a long time. It will be a time of blessing. And Jesus goes on to illustrate this concept with two figures. And that's the first one is that of the builder. It's kind of like a parable where he says, any person who's building a tower is asking themselves the question, do I have enough money to pull off this project? Reminds me of the renovation that Pam and I did while we're going on in COVID. We thought we had all the money that we needed. And then supply chain went, and the rest of us went, and the prices went, and you couldn't get anything. And all of a sudden, the price started to skyrocket. And so we were considering the cost over and over. And it seemed like we're at the end of the project. Will we have enough money for this? Now, this is especially a big problem if you live in the Middle East. And it's connected to this second parable that we find here. The one of, do I have enough money to build a tower? What kind of a tower? Well, it figures in with this. The second figure is that of a battle. Do I have enough men to fight this battle? Because the person who's fighting would be relying on a tower to give them reconnaissance. So this is a big idea of if a king does not have enough money to build a proper battle tower to see off into the distance, and then his enemy finds out that he doesn't have enough money to build this tower, that will bring him shame that will bring him dishonor, and that will place everyone who is under that king's rule in danger, will it not? Because he doesn't have enough money. But here in this second figure, it's, do I have enough men to wage in this war? So the big question is, how should we follow Jesus? We should follow Jesus in this same kind of deliberate manner. Jesus is not selling like some snake oil to people here. In fact, you notice how high he raises the bar in this? He is not trying to, make friends and really punch up his sales numbers on the number of people who are going to be following him. This is not how you meet quota, folks. If you are a recruiter, this is not how you make your numbers. The way you make numbers is you say, oh, it's easy. You can do this. Jesus does not say that this is easy. There is no easy button when it comes to being a disciple of Jesus. It is hard. Not many people can do it. If everyone could do this, everyone would do this. But it takes a lot. It takes taking up your cross. It takes following him in a very deliberate manner. So first we see that these disciples, they are deliberate. And I hope that you and I can say that of ourselves, that we are deliberate in the way that we follow Jesus. That we're not, accidental, apprentices. That's not what Jesus is calling for. He's calling for deliberate disciples. Second, disciples are also different. That's what this second figure in verses 34 through 35, and it's a very short section, and it's used in other passages. It's used in Matthew. It's used in Mark. Here in this passage in Luke, we read simply this: salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? In Jesus' world, salt has many advantages to it. In fact, people were paid in salt. It was so important in the ancient world. This was the gold of their day and of their time. And one of the reasons why it's so important is because salt is a preservative that slows the decay of meat. It was the refrigerator of the ancient world. So it kept things from getting rancid. And how does that apply to us? Because what Jesus is saying here in this passage is, I love Randy and his series that he has, his Stay Frosty series that he's done with us, right? Well, Jesus is saying, stay salty. That's what he's saying here. Stay salty. What does that mean? Well, salt has a distinctive flavor. And if it doesn't taste like salt, guess what? Probably not salt. It's probably something else that's white and chalky. It might be gypsum or some other kind of compound like that, but it's not salt. It isn't salt, and therefore it doesn't have the benefits of salt. But real salt is clearly different. It is, when you just think of putting salt, I'm going to have a burger after worship today, okay? I'm gonna put salt and pepper on it. You can already hear the sizzle. You're welcome. And this, when I'm putting it on there, how much salt am I putting in comparison to the third of a pound of the burger patty? Is it going to be that 1/3 of a pound? No. It just needs a little bit. And this shows how much effect that we as Christians can have in our culture. We don't have to be 90% to bring great good to our neighbors, to our friends, to those who don't even know us. This is why being salty is important. And Jesus also, does Jesus say that we need to apologize for being salty? Does salt apologize for being salty? No, of course not. Disciples, likewise, we don't need to apologize for being like Jesus. We don't need to apologize for following him and following the rules that he has laid down for our lives. We didn't make the rules. We follow a rigorous path. This is not easy, as I mentioned. This is a rigorous path which can't be watered down. Let me illustrate this a little bit. Our oldest son, Caleb, he's all about rock climbing, specifically bouldering. He'll go, there's this one boulder path he likes to go down to in Chattanooga. And they have different rating systems. Some of these boulders are just what we call a V1. That means, well, I can't climb it, but anyone who's actually in shape and 150 pounds, they should be able to climb it. Someone like Caleb, he calls it a warm-up, okay? He's on a V7, okay? V7 is, I love watching him climb. Pam and I will go and we'll watch and we'll be part of this because we love watching him do stuff. But the thing is that Caleb doesn't want a watered down boulder. He doesn't want a V1. And you know what? I think the rest of the world doesn't want us to be watered down disciples either. They don't respect a watered down Christian. The thing is that and there's even some numbers to prove this. There was this book called The Great Dechurching, one of the best books I've probably read in the last 5 years. And it talks about the tendency of 40 million Americans who are believers in Jesus Christ who have left the church. Yes. So they started to ask this wide swath of people, why did you leave? And what would make you come back? And in some of these cases, it gets down to sexuality. This is where it gets interesting, though. Only 8% of people who self-reported as being homosexuals, only 8% said that they would come back to the church if we changed our stance on sexuality. Let me flip that around another way. 92% of homosexuals who were surveyed said, we don't expect the church to change its moral stances. In other words, translation, they don't respect it when you back down from what you have said you believe for 2,000 years. That is why churches that have been of the more affirming variety and have said, oh yeah, it's all good, it's all okay. That's why they are shrinking like crazy. They are not growing. In spite of what the world might tell you, they are some of the fastest shrinking denominations in America. Do you want to know one of the churches that hasn't changed its position and who is actually growing? The Presbyterian Church in America, our denomination. In fact, our denomination, from what we can tell, is the only one that is growing. The ones that also have not compromised, they are, even though they may not be growing, they are shrinking at the slowest rate. They are holding their line the best. That is what the world is telling us. But more important than that is, what does Jesus say, right? Verse 35. In verse 35, the real problem of becoming unsalty becomes clear. It is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown away. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Salt that is not salty is not salt. Be salty. That is what Jesus is saying to us. So, what is Jesus telling us to do? In verses 26 and 27, we get some pretty clear guidance here. First, love Jesus above all else. That's your first take home. And hopefully you can do that even before you get home, right? Hopefully you can do that as we mill around after the worship service. Second, embrace a path that includes suffering, because that's what it means to take up your cross. What I am finding in my tattoo research is that there are so many people that are suffering. And what they seem to be hungry for is to know that there are Christians who have suffered as well and who have come out the other side. They cherish that because it proves that it's not just words. It's something more. Why? Because this was the way of Jesus, right? Jesus suffered. And so to be a disciple is to be like him. And so if you suffer, we should not seek it out, but when it comes our way, realize that Jesus is going to use it to conform you into his very image so that you'll be like him. This is not an easy way to live, but it is a better way to live. This is the way of Jesus.